I never thought much about grain elevators until I met Felix. They were just those tall concrete structures you pass on highway drives through farm country, industrial and impersonal, monuments to agriculture that most people barely notice. But now, every time I see one, my chest tightens in this way that's become familiar over the past year. This mixture of longing and warmth that I've learned means you've really let someone in. I moved to this small Midwestern town in last August for work, one of those economic development positions where they send young professionals to revitalize rural communities. I'm Dylan, 27, and I'd spent my entire adult life in cities. First Chicago for college, then a couple years in Minneapolis. This place had one stoplight, 2 churches, a diner, and a grain elevator that dominated the skyline like a cathedral. Population 843 or so, the sign said, though I suspect that number was optimistic. The first month was lonely in ways I hadn't anticipated. In the city, you can be anonymous and alone, but there's comfort in the crowd, in knowing that somewhere in those streets are people like you. Here, I felt exposed and invisible at the same time. I'd come out in college, lived openly in Minneapolis, dated casually. Moving here felt like stepping backward into a closet I'd worked hard to leave behind. I didn't hide exactly, but I didn't announce anything either. I just existed in this careful neutral space, focusing on work, telling myself it was temporary. I first saw Felix at the town diner on a Wednesday morning in September. I'd gotten into the habit of working there a couple mornings a week, needing the ambient noise to think. He walked in wearing work clothes dusted with what I'd learned was grain chaff, his dark hair slightly messy, and ordered coffee in this soft-spoken way that made the waitress lean in to hear him. He was probably my age, maybe a year or 2 younger, with these striking gray-green eyes that seemed to notice everything without trying. What struck me immediately was how he moved through the space, quietly confident but not taking up more room than necessary. He nodded to a few people, exchanged brief words with the cook, then settled into a corner booth with a newspaper. Old school, I thought. Who reads physical newspapers anymore? I found myself glancing over more than I should have, and once he looked up and caught me staring. I looked away quickly, feeling my face heat up, but not before I saw the smallest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. The second time I saw him was at the grain elevator itself. I'd been tasked with meeting local business owners to understand the town's economic ecosystem, and the elevator was one of the major employers. The manager, a gruff man named Tom, was showing me around the facility, explaining moisture content and storage capacity, when Felix appeared from one of the work areas. Tom called him over to explain some technical process. I immediately forgot because I was too focused on the way Felix's voice changed when he talked about his work, becoming more animated, his hands moving to illustrate points about grain flow and temperature control. He was explaining something about aeration systems when he glanced at me and paused mid-sentence. "Sorry, this is probably incredibly boring if you're not into agriculture," he said, and his smile was apologetic but genuine. "No, it's interesting," I said, and I meant it, though I was more interested in watching him talk than in the actual content. "I'm Dylan, by the way. I'm with the Economic Development Office." "Felix," he said and shook my hand. His grip was firm, his palm slightly rough from work, and the contact lasted maybe half a second longer than professionally necessary. Or maybe I imagined that. "I've seen you at the diner." "You read the actual newspaper," I said, then immediately felt stupid for remembering that detail so specifically. But he laughed, this quiet sound that seemed to come from somewhere genuine. "Habit from my grandfather. He always said if it's on paper, you have to finish reading it before you can scroll away to something else. Forces you to engage with stories you might not choose." He paused, then added, "I saw you working on your laptop. You always look very concentrated." The fact that he'd noticed me, had observed me closely enough to comment on my expression while working, sent a small thrill through my chest that I tried to suppress. We talked for maybe 5 more minutes before Tom pulled Felix back to work. But as I left the facility that day, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation, analyzing every word for meaning that might not be there. Over the next few weeks, we kept running into each other. Small-town life meant paths crossed frequently, but I started to suspect we were both engineering some of these encounters. I'd be at the diner on Wednesday mornings, and he'd arrive around the same time. I'd take evening walks past the grain elevator just as the day shift was ending, and sometimes he'd be leaving, and we'd walk a few blocks together, talking about nothing important, but everything that mattered. He told me about growing up here, about leaving for college in Iowa City to study agricultural engineering, about coming back because his grandfather got sick and someone needed to help with the family farm. He talked about his younger sister who was teaching English in South Korea, about his love for old movies and newer books, about how he'd started working at the elevator after his grandfather died, because he couldn't bring himself to sell the farm but couldn't run it alone either. I told him about Chicago, about studying urban planning with idealistic notions of fixing broken systems, about the complicated relationship with my parents who loved me but didn't quite know what to do with a gay son, about feeling like I was always searching for a place that felt like home. I didn't explicitly come out in that conversation, but I didn't hide it either, and I watched his face carefully when I mentioned it. He just nodded, asked a question about my parents that showed he'd been listening, really listening, and kept walking beside me. It was the listening that got to me, honestly. Felix had this way of remembering everything. Not in a creepy way, but in a way that made you feel seen. 2 weeks after I'd mentioned in passing that I was struggling to find decent coffee in town, he showed up at my office with a bag of beans from a roaster 3 towns over. "I was driving past anyway," he said casually, but I knew the roaster was 40 minutes in the opposite direction from anything he'd need. When I mentioned I'd been reading this obscure novel about rural life in the Depression, he checked it out from the tiny town library and read it so we could talk about it. When I complained about my apartment's terrible heating, he showed up the next weekend with weather stripping and helped me seal the windows, refusing payment, saying it was just what neighbors did. Every conversation we'd ever had seemed to be stored in his memory, and he'd reference things I'd said weeks ago, building on them, showing me that my words mattered to him. I was falling for him, obviously. I knew it on some level, but kept trying to talk myself out of it. I didn't know if he was gay, if he was interested, if I was reading too much into kindness and small-town friendliness. I'd been wrong before, had mistaken straight guys' warmth for interest, and the rejection hurt more in these cases because you lost not just a potential relationship, but the friendship too. And I really didn't want to lose Felix's friendship. But there were moments that felt like more. The way his eyes would linger on my face when I was talking, like he was memorizing the shape of my expressions. How he'd find reasons to touch my shoulder, my arm, brief contacts that sent electricity through me. The time we stayed talking in his truck outside my apartment for 2 hours after he'd helped me move a bookshelf, neither of us wanting to end the conversation, the cab feeling increasingly intimate as darkness fell around us. The shift happened in early November. We'd driven to a neighboring town for their annual harvest festival, something I would never have attended on my own, but Felix had invited me, and I'd have agreed to anything that meant more time with him. We walked through craft booths and ate kettle corn and watched a demolition derby that was somehow both ridiculous and entertaining. It felt like a date without being called one, and I could feel the tension building between us, this unspoken thing that was becoming harder to ignore. On the drive back, as fields blurred past in the darkness, Felix said quietly, "Can I tell you something?" His hands were tight on the steering wheel, and I could see tension in his shoulders. "Of course," I said, my heart suddenly racing. "I'm not good at this," he said, "at saying what I mean. I usually just listen and hope people figure out what I'm thinking, which is obviously not an effective strategy." He laughed nervously. "But I need you to know that I think about you constantly. Like, I wake up wondering if you'll be at the diner, and I take routes past your office, hoping I'll see you, and I read books you mention because I want to understand how you think. And I remember everything you say because it all seems important, because you're important to me. I couldn't breathe. I literally forgot how breathing worked for several seconds. He continued, still looking at the road, words coming faster now. I know this town isn't easy for people like us. I've known I was gay since high school, and I've mostly just kept it quiet because it seemed simpler that way. I dated someone in college, but when I came back here, I just focused on work and family and told myself that was enough. And then you showed up at the diner with your laptop and your city clothes, looking completely out of place and somehow perfect. And I thought, okay, maybe I don't want to keep settling for enough. Felix, I managed to say, and he finally glanced over at me. If I'm reading this wrong, please tell me now, he said. Because I'm about to say that I'm falling in love with you, and I'd rather know if that's completely one-sided before I finish the sentence. It's not one-sided, I said, and my voice came out rough with emotion. God, Felix, I've been trying not to fall for you for 2 months and failing spectacularly. I remember everything you say, too. I know you take your coffee black, but you secretly love those fancy seasonal lattes when you think no one's watching. I know you're afraid of letting people down, especially your family. I know you read the endings of books first when you're anxious because you can't handle the suspense. I know all of this because I can't stop paying attention to you. He pulled the truck over onto the shoulder of the empty highway, put it in park, and turned to face me fully. In the dim light from the dashboard, his eyes were bright with something that looked like hope and fear mixed together. I want to kiss you, he said simply. I've wanted to for weeks. Then why haven't you? I asked, leaning closer. I was scared, he admitted. Scared of being wrong, scared of ruining this friendship, scared of wanting something this much. I'm scared too, I said, close enough now that I could feel his breath. But I think I'm more scared of not knowing what this could be. He kissed me then, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as I responded, one hand coming up to cup my jaw with such gentleness that I felt something crack open in my chest. It was the kind of kiss that felt like a beginning and a homecoming at the same time, and when we finally pulled apart, we were both smiling like idiots. So, he said, his forehead resting against mine. I guess we're doing this. I guess we are, I agreed. The next few months were this strange combination of wonderful and complicated. In private, we were completely ourselves, comfortable in ways I hadn't experienced in previous relationships. Felix's apartment above the town's old hardware store became our refuge, a space where we could be openly affectionate, where I could fall asleep on his couch while he read beside me, where we learned each other's bodies and hearts with equal attention. He was an incredibly thoughtful partner. He'd leave notes in my jacket pockets for me to find later, usually quotes from books I loved or observations about his day that he wanted to share. He learned to cook my favorite meals by watching cooking videos on his phone, presenting them with this proud nervousness that made me love him more. He'd text me photos of sunrises from the elevator, knowing I was always up early for work, little reminders that he was thinking of me. But in public, we were careful. Not closeted exactly, but not openly affectionate either. We'd go to diners in neighboring towns when we wanted something resembling a date. We were friends to most people in town, though I suspect some knew or guessed. Felix's family knew. His sister had apparently figured it out immediately during a video call and was thrilled, but we didn't broadcast it. It bothered me sometimes, that careful distance we maintained in public spaces. I'd gotten used to living openly in the city, and stepping back felt like regression. But Felix reminded me gently that this was his home. These were people he'd known his entire life, and change happened slowly here. He wasn't ashamed, he said, just cautious. And I tried to understand that his relationship with this place was more complex than mine, that he had history and family and a whole life woven into this community. The moment I knew I was completely in love with him, beyond any doubt, was in January. I'd caught the flu, the real kind that leaves you weak and miserable, and I'd texted Felix to cancel our plans, telling him I didn't want to get him sick. He showed up anyway with soup his grandmother used to make, cold medicine, and a stack of DVDs. He set himself up on the opposite end of my couch, kept my water glass filled, didn't complain when I fell asleep during the second movie, and was still there when I woke up in the middle of the night, now asleep himself, his hand stretched out toward me like even unconscious he was reaching for connection. I watched him sleep for a while. This man who remembered every word I said, who showed love through actions more than declarations, who had chosen me despite the complications, and I thought, this is it. This is the person I want to build a life with. When he woke up and caught me staring, he just smiled sleepily and said, "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm in love with you," I said, the words coming out easier than I expected. His smile widened. "Good," he said, "because I'm definitely in love with you." We started talking about the future after that, tentatively at first, then with more certainty. I had another year on my contract with the Economic Development Office, and we both knew I could probably find work in a larger city after that, somewhere with more opportunities and more freedom. But the conversation kept circling back to the same question. What did we actually want? Felix loved this place despite its limitations. He loved the landscape, the work, the slower pace, the way you could see the stars at night without light pollution. He'd built a life here, and while he was willing to leave it for me, I could see the cost of that choice in his eyes when we talked about it. And I was surprised to realize that I'd grown to love it too, or at least to love the life we'd built here together. The town had become less lonely, less like exile, and more like home. I'd made connections through my work, started to understand the rhythms of rural life, found unexpected beauty in the flat landscapes and big skies. My job had another year, maybe more if I wanted it, and I was actually doing work that mattered, seeing tangible results in ways my city job never provided. "What if we stayed?" I said one night in February, lying in his bed, our legs tangled together under warm blankets, while winter wind rattled the windows. He propped himself up on one elbow to look at me. "You'd want to stay here?" "I want to be where you are," I said. "And you're here. Your life is here, and maybe mine could be too." "It's not easy here," he reminded me. "For us." "It's not easy anywhere," I countered. "Just different kinds of difficulty. At least here I have you. At least here I'm doing work I care about. At least here I can see the stars." He kissed me then, slow and deep, and when he pulled back his eyes were bright. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said, and I was. We decided to be more open after that, not dramatically but gradually. We stopped hiding when we went out together, let people draw their own conclusions. Felix held my hand walking down Main Street one Saturday afternoon, and if people stared, we didn't acknowledge it. We went to the diner together on Wednesday mornings and sat on the same side of the booth. We existed as ourselves, as a couple, and let the town adjust. Most people were kind, or at least polite. Some were quietly supportive in ways that surprised us, like the waitress at the diner who started bringing us coffee in 2 cups without asking, or Tom from the grain elevator who mentioned casually that his nephew in Des Moines was gay, and he'd like us to meet him sometime. Some people were less accepting, but they were quieter about it than I'd feared, and their disapproval felt like their problem, not ours. Felix's family embraced me completely. His mother insisted I come to Sunday dinners. His father taught me about farming equipment with patient enthusiasm. His sister sent care packages from Korea addressed to both of us. They made space for me and their family in ways my own parents were still struggling with, and it meant everything. My contract got extended, then made permanent. Felix and I started looking at houses, talking about getting a dog, planning a life that stretched years into the future, We drove to Chicago so I could introduce him to my friends, who loved him immediately and couldn't believe I'd been hiding this relationship in a small town. We talked about marriage, about making things official, about building something permanent together. It's been a year now since that first conversation in his truck on the dark highway. We're sitting on the porch of the house we just bought together, a little farmhouse outside town with land for the dog we're getting next month. The grain elevator is visible in the distance, lit up against the evening sky, and Felix is reading beside me while I work on my laptop, our feet touching on the shared ottoman between our chairs. He looks up from his book and catches me watching him. "What are you thinking about?" he asks. "About how you remembered everything I said," I tell him. "From the very beginning, how you noticed me before I really noticed you, how you made me feel seen." He smiles, and that same quiet smile from the diner a year ago. "You were worth noticing," he says simply. "You still are." I reach over and take his hand, this man who showed me that home isn't a place but a person, that love is built in small, attentive moments, that sometimes the life you're meant for finds you in the most unexpected locations. The grain elevator stands against the darkening sky, no longer just an industrial structure, but a landmark in our story, the place where this all began. "I love you," I say, words I never get tired of saying. "I love you too," he replies, squeezing my hand. "Always have. From that first morning at the diner when you looked up from your laptop and actually saw me." We sit in comfortable silence as stars begin to appear overhead. The same stars that shine over cities and small towns alike, connecting all the places we've been and all the places we'll go, as long as we go there together.